Welcome to Frontline Conversations. Today we have with us Professor Carol Upadhya. Carol is a social anthropologist and honorary visiting professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore. She has spent the past decade studying Amaravati, the capital city of Andhra Pradesh. One question drove her to Amaravati. Why were farmers giving up their land willingly for the capital city project? That too in a region which has a long history of resistance to such land acquisitions. That curiosity produced Carol's latest book. The book was published in May this year. It's called Urbanizing the Future, a new city project in Agrarian South India. It's a book that looks into the grand ambitions of a state through the eyes of farmers, laborers, landless, and everyone who got swept up in a grand dream project. In April this year, Parliament passed a bill recognizing Amaravati as the sole permanent capital of Andhra Pradesh. I think there's an apt time to understand the origin, the consequences, and the reckoning that Amaravati holds for Andhra Pradesh and for India. Welcome, Carol.
Thank you for having me.
So, to begin with, after the 2014 bifurcation and loss of Hyderabad, Amaravati kind of became a way to revive the identity of Andhra Pradesh. This was a greenfield new capital city that Mr. Chandrababu Naidu called. It was a dream for a new state, and what followed was a decade of very turbulent contestations over caste, over politics, over a neoliberal model of urban development. Carol, what drew your attention to Amravati first?
So I have been actually working on Andhra for a very long time. It was the site of my field research for my PhD way back in the 1980s. So I've always had an interest in the region. But after the Andhra Pradesh was bifurcated and the idea of the new capital city was being proposed, I became really fascinated by this notion that it would be possible to build a fully modern, completely, planned city in what was basically an agrarian or a rural space. And Chandrababu Naidu, of course, promoted this idea because, as many people in India talk about all the time, rapid urbanization has led to a certain level of chaos and disorganization in cities and so on. And the idea is that if you can build a new city from ground up, you can bypass or avoid the kinds of problems we've seen in cities across the country. So that was part of it. But for me also, I was very keen to understand um, why and how the planners, the government, and other people thought it was possible to actually pursue and succeed in such an ambitious project, which was obviously difficult, very expensive, with a lot of obstacles in the way. So I decided to study the Amaravati project over a long period of time to see how it developed. And I ended up spending more than 10 years on this research study.
When I was reading through your book, the central question that drove your curiosity, and you've spoken about it quite a bit, was that why were farmers willingly giving up land for the capital city? And again, as we said, that in a region that has a long history of radical resistance. So, could you tell us more about this central question?
Yeah, I mean, this was for me a very central question because, as you said, land acquisition for big projects in India generally meets with resistance, and some of the famous protest movements we've seen have been around that issue. To understand why farmers or most of the farmers in this region were willing to hand over the land, you need to understand the land pooling system that was used by the government. So instead of going in for direct land acquisition, where it's compulsory, where the government takes your land and you get some kind of monetary compensation, in a land pooling system, you give up your land, but what you get in return is a smaller piece of developed land in the new project or the new city. And this was a very novel idea. It took the government and officials and politicians a long time or a fair amount of time to go on ground and convince farmers that this would be a good deal for them. But they succeeded in convincing majority of the landholding families who then went ahead and participated in the land pooling scheme.
So, central to Amravati and the whole giving up the land question is also caste, particularly Kamas. Naidu, who belongs to the same caste. Naidu had already delivered Hyderabad a couple of decades ago, or had brought big tech to Hyderabad, right? So, and I think that was an element of trust that people placed in Naidu, that he was the one who brought all the economic development to Hyderabad. Um, what role did caste play in convincing people of Mr. Naidu's dream of Amravati?
Yeah, caste does play or did play a very big role. And as most people would know, um, in Andhra Pradesh, the politics of caste has always been entangled with the politics of region. And so you have these two major groups in the coastal areas, the Kammas and the Reddys, one of which is embedded more in the coastal region and the other in Rayalaseema. And there's a very long history to that contestation. And so because I think one of the reasons why land pooling succeeded was because the site of the capital was carefully chosen. And like most of the main coastal districts, Guntur, Krishna, etc., most of the land or a big chunk of the land is held by Kammas. Kammas identify very much with the Telugu Desam Party and Chandrababu Naidu. So there's a certain amount of you could say caste loyalty that goes behind this. But the other part of it is what you also mentioned is that Naidu is known as a having kind of transformed Hyderabad by bringing the global tech industry there, and we have all of Cyberabad and all those developments around the city. So looking at that, many people believe that he would make a success of this project as well. So there's multiple factors that go behind this. His ability to kind of sell this project to the public. Of course, there was opposition also. We could talk about that, like with any project. Um, but I think to understand the politics of this kind of urbanization, we need to look at various factors, including, the role of political parties, caste affiliations, money, etc. There are many things behind this.
As you said, there are many things behind it. And of course, while there is caste loyalty and faith in Mr. Naidu as the chief minister, but farmers did not give away land just for that. So, what were the actual mechanisms that the government deployed? I think an absurd detail I remember from that time is farmers were taken to Singapore to show the Singapore as city and
Yeah.
how Amravati is going to look like. Something similar.
Yes.
So, could you speak about all these mechanisms at play? What was the real deal that was offered, and what was the promise that was offered to the farmers?
Right. I mean, that process was very interesting. And as I said, I was doing field work. I would go periodically for a few weeks, every 3, 4 months. And I would go to the villages and speak to especially the Khmer farmers. So I could watch or observe over time how they slowly became convinced, because in the beginning they were definitely not. And so partly there was a very concerted effort by the government, political and ideological officials, politicians, and even Naidu himself going to the village and sitting with the farmers and explaining, what the project would be, how it would benefit them. Um, but the other part of it that I found extremely interesting was that the farmers did not just decide, okay, we're going to accept this deal. They went into very long gone negotiations with the government. They said, okay, fine, if we're going to give up land, we want a better, what's called a package. They wanted better compensation. And the government agreed. They went through 2 rounds of revisions before they could get most people to sign on. So to me, that was really interesting because it shows the strength of political savvy at the village level. I think this is true across Andhra. People are not um, easily duped, and they organized, and they could organize partly because again, there's a caste network at the village level, and people they could come together very quickly and then kind of collectively decide that okay, we're going to go ahead with this, but we want to make sure that our interests are protected.
Initially, there was also some sort of coercion involved, and there's some people who remained unwilling. Do you have any case studies from, or do you remember your fieldwork from?
Yes. I mean, I remember very clearly one day when I was visiting some of the villages when the land pooling was just kind of getting underway. They had opened revenue department offices, sub-register offices in all the villages to do the paperwork. There was a heavy police presence. There was a kind of intimidation there for anyone who might be coming to like criticize people like me or journalists were being kept out. So there was a level of intimidation. Um, and but I think to me that was less important than the fact that the government succeeded in persuading so many people. Interestingly, there was a smaller group of especially big comma owners who refused to pool the land and still have refused for their own reasons. And there were various forms of kinds of resistance. One was, again, there's always rumors. Like some people would say, okay, these guys are just holding out for a better deal. But other people were really coming down on the whole question of environmental risk, and the fact that the site that was selected for the capital city is basically in a floodplain, and they pointed out, the fact that the city would be in a very kind of geographically risky place, and the fact that many of the villages close to the river, this capital city, as you know, is was chosen precisely so that it would be on the banks of the Krishna River. That's what Naidu wanted, that river facing development. But those are also villages that were very productive agriculturally. People were making a good living. And so there was resistance across all those villages as well.
I'll get to the ecological risks in a bit, but since you mentioned the challenges of fieldwork, this was a decade long project. Could you talk more about the patchwork methodology that you speak in your book? Because it was very interesting, and I think you spent the longest time in Amaravati. It
Yeah.
said this was a lasting investment in the city, and multiple field trips cutting across, different sections of farmers, activists, and interest groups. How did it help arrive at the architecture, the structure of the book?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a sociologist basically, and we do projects. We normally plan a few months or a year and a half of field work all at a stretch so that, you finish your ground research and then you go and write. But because it was obvious that the city would take time to develop, and I'm not going to go and, park myself there for the entire stretch, I decided to do what I mentioned, which is go periodically for a week or 10 days or 2 weeks, gather what I could, come back, and then again go to, so I could see over time what was happening. And when I would go to the field, I mean, my idea was to talk to every possible kind of constituent, from government officials to, the farmers on the ground, landless families, everyone in the affected villages, really, other constituents such as real estate, brokers, businessmen in Vijayawada. Everyone had an interest in this project, and I wanted to be able to map out how different groups were responding to it. Um, so it's a patchwork in the sense that I have, snapshots of what was happening at different points in time. And then the question was, how do I weave this all together into a story? And because, the project is obviously still developing, I could have kept on with this kind of field work, but I thought at some point I need to put it, you know, come to a close and actually write something. Otherwise, it would be an endless kind of a project.
How did you confront with the tension in the book? Not the book per se, but Amravati. On one hand, you have Kama farmers who are primary benefactors, as what people call, and then you also have the landless and the Dalits. There was this tension in the field. Whenever I went, also I experienced that. Okay, there's two different sets of aspirations or hopes tied to it.
Yeah, I mean, this is very important, and I think it gets lost in a lot of the journalistic reports about the city. It's important to realize that only around 30% of households actually were landholders. We are talking about a new city being built in a zone of more than 50,000 acres, where and 29 villages, right? But within those villages, it's only the landholding households who theoretically will benefit from the land pooling scheme. very early in this process, the government banned cultivation. And that was one of the tactics they used to kind of force farmers to give up their land. So when they banned cultivation, obviously all the other households, most of them who depended on agriculture but didn't own land, so agricultural workers, tenant farmers, they are now out of work. And the government, of course, is very aware of this, and they develop social welfare schemes and various projects to try to, find alternative livelihoods for these families. But the point about a land pooling scheme or any kind of land acquisition, I suppose, is that it creates or it widens disparities between those who have land and those who do not. And therefore, it also widens caste difference because landholding is very closely aligned with caste. So I did very much try to understand the predicament of OBC and Dalit households and others, many of whom were, as I said, kind of left in the lurch. There was mobilization there, and especially amongst Dalits, who in this region have a very high level of political consciousness. But still, in the face of a kind of very, a big project like this where the government is very invested, there's not a whole lot that groups or movements can do to stop. Basically, the tactics were to try to figure out how they can get the most benefits from the government in return for the sacrifice that they have made.
Another peculiar problem we have discussed in the past is that this is not truly a greenfield project in the sense it's not a blank slate that the government is starting from. We have entire residential localities and villages where people already live, where surrounding which these glitzy buildings are going to come up in the next few years. So you've documented that as well about this.
Yeah, so this was one of the key questions I kept asking whenever I would go to CRDA, which is the Capital Region Development Authority, and talk to the planners. And I kept saying, what about the villages? Because we have, as I said, 29 villages. It's the agricultural land that is acquired. The villages, they would promise, will remain intact. But when you are building a fancy new city around those villages with new infrastructure, new types of buildings, etc., what happens to them? And I never got a good answer from any of the planners. I think either they thought that eventually they will develop, they will become more urban, and they will get connected into the infrastructure of the new city. But many people admitted that what we see in other places like Bangalore or Hyderabad is that these villages kind of turn into slums or they turn into low income neighborhoods because you cannot integrate them with a planned city because the lot sizes are small, roads are narrow, people are not well off, houses are, often not very good. So what is the plan to develop, or not just the spatial infrastructure of the village, but what about the people who live there? What livelihood can they look forward to? And of course, government will say, yes, we have many plans for these people, but I looked very closely at the planning, the social development planning, and I was not very convinced that, their future is really problematic, I would say.
And while we have the livelihood uncertainties and the problematic future, as you say, but all this sits in a flood prone zone, which was a warning that I think the government chose to not pay heed to or ignore. So, what have you seen about this part? Like, there was so much concern about the ecological concern around the site of Amravati. Why do you think there was resistance from the government to listen to the experts?
I mean, the government, first of all, there were critics in the beginning who pointed this out, and the government was well aware of it. So if you look at the master plan that was actually created by these Singapore-based consultants, they also did all their homework and they have all the detailed geospatial studies, etc. But the solution was, well, we're going to develop a flood control plan. And they have done that. It's there in the paper. It's partly also implemented. It's very expensive. There's a lot of, you have to put in new pumping stations. You have to do a lot of land contouring. There's a lot of technical stuff. And so many people were saying, why spend all this money on flood control? Why not just find a site that doesn't have this problem? So I don't know what the answer to that is. Maybe any site he would have chosen would have some problem with the other. But in some ways, this was a good choice or a clever choice, because I spoke about the river, the villages close to the river where there was resistance because the agriculture is very productive. But in the capital zone, majority of villages were in the dryland, the uplands and the drylands, doing rain-fed farming, getting one crop a year. Those farmers were not well off, and now suddenly their land is worth, for going from 15 lakhs, it was now worth 1.5 crore rupees per acre. They were the first to give up their land. So, those kind of considerations, I think, took precedent, that the government had to find a site where they could convince people to participate. And there's not many such places that one could. They did, of course, consider other zones, but every possible site has drawbacks. And as I said, Naidu was very, very keen that we need to have this riverfront development. But the other, I think, clever part of the location is that the new capital is right across the river from Vijayawada, which is the second biggest city in the state. And so the idea was, just as they did with Hyderabad and Cyberabad, you have certain kind of synergies coming from the fact that there's already a big urban center located next to you, but you're developing an urban, a kind of a satellite from the ground up, so that you don't have all the congestion and the kind of urban chaos you see in such towns.
I mean, where else could it have come up is another question that everyone has from time to time.
Yes.
So we can now discuss about what happened after the Amaravati project became real, like the land pooling was completed and the real. And I think you talk quite a bit about it in your book about the speculative land market that took off. Even as Amaravati was taking shape, it's still taking shape. Um, so conversations among the elites the rich always used to be about real estate, land deals, and property deals, and what they thought the city could become potentially in 20 years. Those always. So what who captured those gains and what were your observations around that time?
Yeah, I mean, that's very important. And this happens, of course, whenever there's a mega project that's announced in India, and and there's going to be land acquisition, you find these speculative land booms happening where, people want to come in, people that is, rich people from the cities or real estate people, etc., come in and want to buy up land because they know even if they're paying an escalated price, that land will be so much more valuable in the future as this development takes place. So immediately there was this market that took off. And an interesting thing about, and again, because a lot of it is just, it's very, not under the table, but a lot of individual deals, a lot of cash involved. We don't have data on that. But we have stories from the farmers. And I know that almost every household at that point sold at least some of their land. Even if they owned 2 acres, they would have sold 1 acre. And immediately they would have 3 or 4 crores in the pocket, right? And then the other land, which is remaining, they would give to the land pooling scheme. So that is one of the things I didn't mention. That land market is one of the things that convinced the farmers to give up their land, because some of the land was so valuable. But then the question is, who got that land, right? And some estimates say that 1/3 to 1/2 of all the land changed hands even before land pooling began. So now you have land in the hands of, big businessmen, politicians, film stars. I mean, you name it, whoever had that kind of money. And they are the ones then who came and started giving land for pooling because they thought it's a good deal. Um, so there was this kind of investment in the idea of Amaravati, but of course it was also very risky, right? Because the land that you get in return for giving up your land, those land parcels, will be worth money in the future only if the city develops. Otherwise, it's an empty piece of land. So everything hinges on the project developing as per the plan. And that is where I argue in the book that the project itself is speculative. The land pooling scheme was speculative. not just the land market. The whole thing is speculative. But like in any speculative market, there's always a chance it will succeed and people will make money. There's also a chance that everything can collapse like a Ponzi scheme.
So I think around this time, Mr. Naidu was also successful in bringing in World Bank and the usual institutions he relies on. And how do you pursue their interest in Amravati?
Mm. Well, I mean, obviously, one of the big issues that the government faced was finance, right? It's a big project. You need money for infrastructure, etc. Government of India was not coming forth very much for political reasons. World Bank does fund these kind of projects because it's seen as a way of kicking off economic development. But the World Bank loan that they applied for, even by the time the government fell in 2019, that had not been sanctioned because World Bank loans also have to be sanctioned by the central government, and there was a tension between the parties. So one of the big problems that Naidu faced was precisely the issue of financing. Like, how do you actually pay for all this? I mean, the things have changed since 2024, again, because of political equations. But I guess going back to the first period, one thing I could mention would be the interest of the Singapore government in the project. So as you know, Naidu had requested Singapore to help devise, create the master plan for free. They were very involved in the planning. And then Singapore was given or Singapore-based companies were given the so-called startup capital project, which was a smaller area within the planned city where they would begin the work. And they were given this project. So then the question becomes, and so money was being invested by these Singapore-based companies. So then the question becomes, what is their interest, right? And that's what many of the critics and activists were raising. And in fact, Singapore, they were trying to work a deal with the government of Andhra Pradesh where land would actually be handed over to them rather than, on a lease basis, that they actually wanted to have ownership of 5 acres of land, which they would develop property and then sell it. And that's where they would get a profit. And this, if that plan had gone through, it was being negotiated at the time the government changed. It would have been the first time in India, post-independence India, that land was actually handed over to a foreign entity like that. So it was, it was one of the ways in which the government was trying to bring in new finance, basically by handing over land to various entities. The other mechanism was that the idea of the plan was that government makes infrastructure and then various entities come and propose projects. So like, I want to put up my company there, educational institutions, etc. And so they bid and the government allocates land. And a lot of the land that had been acquired was allocated during that period. Um, and so that's one source from which the government was getting finance, basically by selling the land that they had acquired from farmers.
Right. Like it truly knew the project right to the core of it. Despite all this, and I think right when Amravati could have come to some fruition kind of a point, the elections came, and some people did believe that part of the reason Mr. Naidu lost the elections was because of his singular obsession during the first term was Amravati, and he kind of did not focus on the rest of the state or the developmental issues that the rest of the state was facing after bifurcation. So then Mr. Jagan Mohan Reddy came to power, and it became this like inversion of the Amravati dream. Things toppled, and it was another kind of a turbulent period, right? So then Mr. Jagan Mohan Reddy came up with the idea of three capitals. Uh, what was the three? Do you think the three capitals was a genuinely alternative vision or just a political?
No, it was. And in fact, if you look at the Shivaramakrishnan report, which had been commissioned by the central government right in the beginning, the committee's remit was to study the question of where should the new capital come. And they toured every district, talked to a lot of people, and they themselves said, there's no, especially Andhra being, this very long state from north to south, stretching along the coast. They said there's no reason in this age of, technology and communications are so good now. Why do you need all the government functions to be in one place? You could have it, you know, you could split up government departments and put them in different towns, and then different, it would be more accessible to people. So I think Reddy maybe picked up on that, and the idea was exactly this: that you have administrative capital in one place, judiciary in another, and the three branches. You have the three branches of government in three different places. So legislature, administration, and judiciary.
Judiciary, yes.
Yeah. So it's not a bad idea at base, but many people felt that Jagan Mohan Reddy he just never liked the Amaravati project. He didn't want it for political reasons, for caste reasons, and again, maybe I'm echoing too much my Kama informant's view, but the idea there was that if he were to continue with that project and it becomes a success, the credit would go to Naidu and not to him. So, like, what's the point, right? So, but the tragedy of this is that he could not pull it off because, of course, there were challenges in the court and all of that. But the tragedy was that the Amaravati project itself more or less lapsed during this time. All that was happening stopped. Almost all the building work stopped. And then you had all these sites or construction sites that were partly done, kind of left to rot and get filled with water during the rains. And so this huge investment that had begun was now getting wasted. So, and of course, the farmers were extremely upset because their land was already gone. But now they said, like, what is our future? Because if the capital doesn't come here, if the city doesn't develop, then they are left holding these parcels of land that are worthless.
Right. I think, yeah, it was a lot of wastage of resources for sure, but I think that's when the Save Amravati protests also began. I think it was one of those mobilizations which was quite surprising and different from usual land struggles, where people were protesting in favor of dispossession. People were protesting ferociously to defend a project. And
Yes.
so you call it formation of new political subjects. Uh, so could you just talk about that period of Amravati's?
Yeah, I mean, the Save Amaravati movement was really interesting because, um, as I said, the farmers were extremely bitter and disappointed that this had happened, that the project was being abandoned. But to see them form a social movement like this, or a political movement, agitating, for the main point was that the Amaravati project must continue as planned. But basically, what they're saying is, rather than protesting against losing their land, they are protesting in favor of a project that, for which they gave up their land. But of course, what they are really arguing is that they want to save their property. One of the issues they faced, and many of the protesters I spoke to, they spoke about this, was that people, as you said, people in the rest of the state felt neglected. There was so much focus on the Amaravati project. It's like, what about all the other districts, all the other people? So people, when they started protesting, people in other places said, you're only worried about your own property. You don't care about the rest of us. So one of their main campaign planks was to try to convince people that Amaravati is a project for the benefit of the whole state. And when they took out these padayatras and they did their publicity campaigns, they kept saying that, look, we have given up our land, not for ourselves, but for you, for everyone in the state. Because if the capital develops, it's going to be good for everyone. So that was a really interesting, I think, slant that they took. And I think they partly succeeded in convincing at least part of the public that, it was very unjust what was done to them.
I think women also were participating in huge numbers around that time.
Yes, in fact, women took a leadership role in this, I think partly because, for one thing, all of this was happening mostly during the COVID lockdowns. So there wasn't a lot they could do publicly, but also because whenever there were protest camps in all the villages, when they would take out protest marches and all, the police would come and lathi charge and the men would get beat up. And I think there was a sense that women would perhaps be attacked less, which was not true. In fact, many women were arrested and had cases put against them and so on. Um, and so I was really interested in the fact that women seem to be at the forefront of this. And I spoke to some of the women leaders who talked about their narrative about land pooling was really interesting. They said, look, we are small farmers. Many of us are from small landholding families, 3 or 5 acres. The land that we have is not only for us, it's for our children. And that's the way peasant farmers always think about land, right? I got it from my forefathers. It will pass to my children. This is the core of our family and our wealth. Um, and they would say, so we have, with great difficulty, decided to give up our land to the government. And now this has happened. What can I tell my children? Like, I've given away their legacy. And so they would frame it in this narrative that I am fighting for the future of my family. It's not about, just our property. It's about my children and their children.
The protests and did help. I think that did dent Jagan's image quite a bit in at least that region. And now Mr. Chandrababu Naidu is back at the helm in a stronger coalition government that too. So, and I think gradually the LND has returned, and so has the World Bank. And now Mr. Naidu has sought 40,000 more acres in the second round of land pooling. So, can you comment on Amravati as it stands today? I know this is something that your book doesn't cover yet, but since we are kind of trying to provide a whole picture of Amravati. So, can you comment on
Sure.
Amravati as it stands today and the government buildings, the government housing, the government offices? Most of it is government built infrastructure, which is very unlike what was promised that we'll build the bare bone structure in the private sector and the private investment is going to flow, right? So, yeah. So, how do you see this?
Yeah. I mean, that is one of the issues. I have not been looking at it much in the last 2 years. I believe it is going on well now because, again, they did get more money from the central government, the World Bank, and so on. But like I said, one of the issues was that the whole concept depends on private investment. It depends on these private investors coming in and putting up, some kind of a, industry or, commercial venture, et cetera. That's how the city will grow. But when you speak to business people, and especially after Jagan came and everything came to a standstill, I think even now, they are wary about the future, but especially their one line is that we can come in only when the infrastructure is ready, right? How can I come in and put a shopping mall where there's no road or there's no customers also because people are not yet living there? So it's kind of a catch 22 where you want investors to come, but they won't come till you invested. And so you need public investment, but the money is not there. So, and because the area is so large, it's not going to develop all at once. One of the criticisms has been that if you see there are about 5 educational institutions now already functioning, SRM University is there, VIT is there. So they came in quite early. They set up their campuses, students are there, but each one is in a different corner of the site. There's nothing integrated, and you have to go on a Kutcher road to get there. And if you step outside the campus, there's nothing there, right? So it takes time for all these things to come together. And I think private investors, I haven't spoken with people recently, but they're waiting to see, right? They want to make sure that their investment is not going to just collapse. But the other point I want to make about this, and this speaks to the question of the idea of planned urbanization, right? Which is what the Amaravati project is that even though within the project zone, a lot of it is still just empty land, things are not made yet, all around the boundary. So you look at the Vijayawada Guntur Highway and all the main roads around that are booming with real estate projects, right? And we're talking about a region where we never had high-rise buildings. It was all kind of very small town kind of look. And now suddenly that whole area looks like what you see in Hyderabad and Bangalore. Why? Because real estate companies come in and invest and make new projects in places where they think there's going to be development in the future. They know the government has already shifted to Amaravati. More and more government people, other institutions will come. There will be demand for flats and so on. So all that takes place. So you have this kind of contradictory form of development where within the planned project zone, there's not much happening. And just outside the zone, there's rapid urbanization, which is not planned or not top down planned. And that speaks to this whole question of how do we understand urbanization and how do you actually plan for urbanization in a way that kind of caters to the interests of all groups and classes and doesn't just cater to real estate interests, for example.
So kind of this model embeds a structural, political, and other forms of fragilities in it by its own nature, right? So how do you? So I think we've come towards the end of the interview where you also address this partly in your book about how does Amravati experiment. Uh, what does Amravati tell us about the urban development? Where urban development is heading in India, or is this kind of becoming a blueprint, or is it a cautionary tale, or both?
In some ways, you could say it's a blueprint, even though we don't have other examples. I mean, we do have examples of so-called greenfield cities, which are more often satellite cities like Gandhinagar outside of Ahmedabad, right? So those kind of examples are not the same because often it's just meant either for government offices or residential housing. They're not full-fledged cities. The idea of Amaravati was that it would be a full-fledged city with all various kinds of economic activities, various kinds of communities, etc. And I think you can't assess you can't really assess its success for the next 50 years at least. We don't know. But I think it's clearly not a model that India can follow, partly because land is just not available. And also because the history of urbanization in India and everywhere really is not a history of planned urbanization. Planning, this kind of top down planning, very rarely works the way it's supposed to. And there's been many studies from across the world that show that. And I think many urban planners also have realized that the only way to manage urbanization and urban growth is to work with what you have and find these kind of more ground level incremental interventions you can do to direct urban growth rather than saying, this is what the city should look like now, let's go do it. Because it really creates so much disruption. It opens opportunities for certain people to make a lot of money. It displaces and dispossesses many more, so I think these are issues that need to be much more discussed and understood by planners, by the general public, when we talk about the whole problem of the urban in India.
Thank you, Carol, for speaking to us about your book. And I hope our readers pick up your book, and I hope to collaborate with you again on Amravati soon in the future.
Thanks so much for having me.